All right. Do we have distortion again? I hope we don't. I don't know what the heck is going on now. Okay. Distortion, yes or no? That's what I want to know right now. Sounds good. Okay. Everything's okay. Good. All right. I apologize, folks. That was very, very, very frustrating. I was trying to get... somebody says echo. Do we have echo? No? What was it? I wish I knew what it was, Johnny. I was trying to get Johnny in on the show tonight. And we had all sorts of issues with the audio with Skype, so we couldn't get it working, I'm afraid. So I apologize for that. I was hoping to get Johnny in the show so that we could discuss tonight's topic, but sadly I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And I don't want to waste everybody's time trying to make it work somehow. So it's something that Johnny and I are going to have to test and see if we can get working so that I can have him as a guest on my show sometimes. So I apologize, folks. Not a great start, because everything sounded fine in my headphones. So I'm really sorry that you guys had horrible distortion. It's not an ideal start. So okay, let's start again. I don't think I will carry on with the intro music because there's no point now. But you were listening to a somewhat distorted version of my instrumental brass band piece, Softly Spoken, which I put out in 2017, I think it was. 2017. Yeah, 2017. So that's what you were listening to for a little while there. I apologize that it was all distorted and crackly. I have no idea why it was. Johnny was saying actually when we were testing Skype beforehand that it was all distorted and crackling, and I was hearing none of it. It was sounding fine in my ears. So I don't know what's going on there, but it could well be that my secondary interface that I'm using is trying to tell me that it's coming to the end of its life, which is a bit annoying, to say the least. But hey, I have had it for nearly 10 years, so I guess it's had a good run. Okay, so Johnny says I get plenty of FaceTime. So good evening, everybody. I'm not very good at starting my shows when something like that happens, so I need to learn to do better than that. So tonight's show is going to be all about mixing in mono, or at least that was the plan, and Johnny and I were going to discuss it and share both of our experiences and our views, because we both come, I think, from different perspectives on this, and I know Johnny is thinking more about it, more about how, the value of doing it for getting better separation between your individual channels. It does make you work harder with EQ. You do have to work harder because everything is collapsed on top of each other. So when you're mixing in mono, so it does make you work harder because if you've got like a whole bunch of guitars, you need to spend a lot more time doing a bunch of EQ moves to try and get those guitars so that you can hear each one of them. Once you get to the point where you can hear each one of them in mono, then you can flip your mix back out to stereo. And all of your panning positions that you've already set will mean that those guitars will now sound glorious. Not just great, because, you can do all of that separation in stereo just fine. But here's the thing with stereo. When you're doing your mix in stereo, it's very easy just to go, okay, I'm going to shove that guitar over there and that guitar over there, and they won't meet. There won't be any issue. And that's the false sense of security that you lull yourself into by thinking, if I put one guitar over on the extreme left and one guitar over on the extreme right, even if I've done hardly anything other than a high-pass filter, and perhaps they are two recordings of exactly the same guitar, maybe two different performances, but still the same guitar. The two guitars are going to have the same frequency response, as every instrument, every sound, every voice has its own unique sonic footprint or fingerprint, if you like. That's the way I like to think about it. So even if it is the same guitar, let's say a particular guitar you are playing has a nice little bump at about 400 hertz. Let's say you record that same guitar 5 times and you put 3 of them on the right and 3 of them on the left. Well, what you've done is you've now multiplied that bump at 400 5 times. And so you think, okay, if I just put them either side, they're not going to meet each other. And so you're not going to, you think, therefore, that you're not going to get that issue raising itself at 400 hertz. Well, here's a tip for you. Play your mix, go out the door, walk down the corridor. Can you hear all 5 of those guitars separately and distinctly? Because if you can't, you know that those guitars are now collapsed effectively by reflections around the room and out through the corridor, that by the time it gets to your ears, the whole thing is in mono anyway. So if by the time you get there, you can't hear those 5 guitars, you've not finished. You've not finished EQing those guitars. And so that's why I mix in mono. I mix in mono so that I can do all of that separation with the guitars stacked on top of each other, collapsed to mono, so that I can get them all separated, so that when I then flip out to stereo and I still take a walk down the corridor, hopefully, if I've done the work right, when I go halfway down the corridor, I can hear all 5 of those guitars nice and clear and distinct and separate from each other. And so that's your objective. And if you find that, okay, I can hear some of the guitars, okay, we need to come back, go back to mono, do a little bit more, and repeat as necessary until you get what you want. So that really is, for me, mixing in mono in a nutshell. Now, the cool thing is that a lot of PreSonus interfaces have a mono button. A lot of other manufacturers' interfaces have a mono button these days. And the PreSonus monitor stations, they all have mono buttons on them. Various mixers also have mono buttons on them. So there's got to be a reason why all of these pieces of gear have a mono button built in. Well, it's because everybody realizes the value of being able to process in mono. That's why they're there. And the same for Studio One. Studio One has a mono button for that reason. Because it's easy. It means you can collapse the whole thing to mono and quickly get to work. So, the PreSonus guys have obviously thought long and hard about the importance of being able to do work in mono in every aspect of the signal chain. So they've provided mono capability on every device. And I think that's a great thing. So there you go. So that's what I think about mixing in mono. Ken Moss is here and he says, just tried mixing mono today. I think it worked well. Still have some issues to fix in the mix, but was surprised at how much easier it was overall once I got a decent mix in mono. Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. And Bobby and Jonny are talking about one of Bobby's mixes, which is cool. Deer Creek is here. He says, doesn't electronically combining to mono react much differently than distance? You'll still hear 2 sources out of phase in the other room, but maybe not when collapsed to mono in the box. Possibly, but I don't think it matters. To be honest, I don't think it matters too terribly much, because by the time you hear this, the whole stereo mix down the corridor, it's effectively summed to mono anyway by the time it gets to your ears. And so I think having a hardware mono button or a software mono button in Studio One, they do exactly the same thing. I've tested it. I've had Studio One kept in stereo, and then I hit the mono button on my interface, and then I compare the two. I've done A/B testing between a Studio One mono button and my interface mono button, and the exact same result is true. So I'm able to mono either in Studio One in the box, or on the interface, or on my monitor station, and get exactly the same results. And then I've also done the test where I've put it in mono in the room here in my mix room, and then I've put it back into stereo and gone down the hallway, and essentially you have the same thing. And that's what you're after. Whether it's scientifically, very, very specifically, exactly mono in either scenario is not necessarily relevant in order for you to get the same effect. If you can achieve the same effect of being effectively collapsed to mono by the time the music gets to your ears when you're down the hallway, which is what happens anyway, that's just physics. Physics 101. Sound bounces around, and by the time it gets to you, it will be effectively summed to mono by the time it gets to your ears, because you're not in the stereo sweet spot where I am right now between my speakers, which is why this is our mix position. Our mix position isn't down in the hallway. But the hallway test is great for being able to check your low end. The hallway test is also great for being able to check how your mix sounds in mono. Because you put yourself in a realistic position of how the end user is going to listen to the mix. They're not going to be sat in this nice little triangle between two speakers listening to your artist's finished record. They're not, because people don't do that. Only mix engineers do that, and audiophiles do that. But ordinary people that just like to listen to music for pleasure, they walk around the house. They'll go into the kitchen to make coffee. They'll go upstairs to go and get laundry down. They'll do whatever, and they'll have music on in the house. But by the time it gets to your ears, it's in mono. Same is true if you're in a restaurant, and they've got music on in the restaurant. Wherever you're seated, you're never in that perfect, nice little stereo triangle sweet spot, unless you ask for that specific table. But otherwise, you're not going to be there, which means it's effectively going to be summed to mono. Or if you're in a shopping mall and your artist's record gets played on the PA of the shopping mall, you're nowhere near any of those speakers in a position to form a nice little stereo image. So the mix is going to be effectively summed to mono. Is the mix going to sound great in mono? Because if it sounds great in mono, it'll sound greater in stereo. So nail the mono mix, the stereo mix will be 1,000 times better. But it will sound great in mono, great enough for somebody to still enjoy it in mono and still be able to hear all the elements of the mix in mono. So that's really what it's fundamentally about. Whether it's scientifically 100% exactly the same scenario between using the mono button here and going down the hallway or not, I don't think is relevant. I don't think that's necessarily relevant to the usefulness of the exercise. The usefulness of the exercise is, either literal summing to mono via a mono switch, or down the hallway where acoustics and physics play the part in doing much the same thing. So I think, in answer to your question, I don't think it's necessarily a big difference. Yeah, Deer Creek is saying it isn't an accurate mono test. Tested out as sources will arrive at separate times, even small as it may be. Yeah, you will get different phase issues, for sure. But that's not necessarily the point, I don't think. The point is they won't arrive in your ears in stereo. They just won't. That's just physics. Yes, the different elements of the mix may well. The low end will get to you later than the high end, perhaps, because the high end travels faster than the low end. For example, stuff like that is going to be that's going to be true. But so there will be some phase issues, but that's just the way physics is. But it's still collapsed to mono. It's the same thing, whether you're pressing a button or whether you're going down the hallway. It's still, the end result is the sound is coming to your ears, not in glorious stereo. I mean, I'm not going to walk down the hallway and hear my guitar that I panned over the left in the mix coming into my left ear, and the guitar that I panned in the right coming into my right ear when I'm, 30 or 40 yards down the corridor. That's just not going to happen. It doesn't work like that. And that's essentially all I'm saying, really, in answer to your question. 30 people watching, 32. That's awesome. Fantastic. Bobby says, wish I could play it loud enough to go through the house, but wife gets mad if she can't hear her soap. Yeah, my wife is exactly the same, Bobby. Which is why I am very, very blessed that I can work in the house during the daytime. When my wife is out doing her job as a community midwife and my kids are at school, I can work in here, and I have the whole house to myself, so I can do the corridor test all the time without any issue. I guess it is just the same, it's just the same thing, really. Okay, dear Creek, we're not going to get into an argument here, okay? I'm not really interested in arguing over minutia. The point is, and the point remains, that if I go down the corridor, my left-hand guitar is not going to arrive in my left ear, even though I panned it over onto the left in my stereo mix. When I get down there, it's not going to arrive in my left ear in the same way as it does when I'm in the sweet spot. It's collapsed to mono, effectively. And that's just the way it is. Mike says, sometimes I feel crazy when I walk around my studio and hallway and bathroom listening to my mix. That can't be normal, but it needs to be done. Yeah, absolutely. Johnny Guy with the $10 donation. Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it, mate. Okay, She Stula, let me start that again. She Studios is here. That's my good friend Sheila. Very good to see you. And Deep Stasis is here and says hello. Hello to you too, my friend. Good to see you. Good to see everybody, actually. Just about everybody that is anybody that is a regular of either mine or Johnny's shows is here, which is very, very cool. And I appreciate all of you guys being here. Very happy to have you, and I'm a little bit considerably annoyed that I'm not able to use Skype tonight to get Johnny into this discussion, because it would be fantastic if I could do that. Because you'd have a couple of different perspectives, and we could talk this out, and you guys could contribute in the chat as well. I mean, I appreciate that you guys are doing that already. So I appreciate that. All right, okay, let's move on from talking about mixing in mono and the value of it. Mike with the $10 donation. Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. So let's move on to actually just let's broaden this out into more of your questions that you've got. You might have questions on mixing mono, which is great. If you have, please do bring them. And if you have any other questions about mixing, mastering, recording, songwriting, arranging, all of those, we can cover those as well. And I'm happy to demonstrate stuff in Studio One as well. For sure. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate everybody watching. It's very, very cool. Bob Powell is here. Hey, Bob. Good to see you. He says, when I used to DJ, I always used a mono mix so that the sound from each of the speakers contained all of the music. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a very good idea. Definitely in a club scenario, that's a really great idea. So again, there's another scenario in which a mono mix, and a good, clear mono mix where all the elements are clearly heard, is important. So again, that's where the value of being able to do the mix in mono and EQ in mono is really, really helpful. Ken Moss with the $10 donation. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it. Johnny has a question. Do you feel if you mix in mono, you might add less instruments to your song as they might start fighting each other? No, I don't actually. When you're in the songwriting phase and the arranging phase, I would say this, you can actually shape the sound of your song up front by choosing when you have certain instruments playing and when you have certain instruments not playing. You can vary the texture from a very thin texture, like just an acoustic guitar and a vocal, to really big, fat texture where you've got maybe, I don't know, you've got 4 or 5 electric guitars, drums, bass, percussion, electric piano, acoustic piano, Hammond organ, horns, backing vocals, strings, and you've got all of that going on in a particularly big chorus. Now, there are some of those instruments that are going to share similar, a similar kind of EQ fingerprint. So that being the case, those are the instruments that you kind of need to think carefully about in terms of EQ when you get to mixing. Now, when you're mixing in mono, everything falls in on top of itself. So you do have to do more work in EQ to separate those elements, particularly the ones that have similar acoustic properties or similar frequency responses. You definitely do have to do more work. So like in particular electric guitars, if you have a whole bunch of electric guitars layered up, even if they're not the same guitar, even if you have like a Les Paul Special with a Telecaster and a Strat and an Ibanez, and they're all recorded using different microphones and different amps, using different tones, all of those things will start to give you some separation because a different guitar has a different tone, a different amp has a different tone, a different mic is going to capture in a different way, and add different amounts of coloration. You know, a solid state amp will do one thing, a valve amp will do another to the sound. So all of those elements will create some separation for you up front. But you can separate further by skillful use of EQ, particularly if you've got like maybe a couple of Telecasters, where you've maybe gone for 2 Telecasters playing very, very similar parts versus, I don't know, 2 Ibanezes on the other side. So your pairs, your 2 Telecasters and your 2 Ibanezes, you need to kind of separate the 2 Telecasters out and the 2 Ibanezes out from each other. And then, of course, you need to think about where are the common frequencies between the 2 guitars. Because, you know, some will have, you know, one guitar will have a particular bump or a particular dip, and another guitar will have a particular bump and a dip. Now, if those bumps conflict, then you need to do some complementary EQ to separate those apart. But when it comes to actually, you know, kind of writing the song and arranging the song, I think the more instruments you add to the song, the thicker the texture, the more work you're going to have to do in the mixing phase to separate all of those out. It'll definitely be a much more demanding job, which is why, you know, mixing a jazz trio is easier than mixing, you know, 120-piece symphonic orchestra. Because, you know, there are more elements there, there are more instruments there, there are more frequencies present, and more potential for things to build up, like more potential for low mids to build up, for example, or more potential for 2K to start to build up. So, you know, those are the kind of things you need to be thinking about. And that's Kirk McWright with a $5 donation. I appreciate it, mate. And he says, "You're doing a great job, Johnny, despite the technical difficulties. Keep up the good work." I appreciate that very much, folks, and I really do appreciate your support. Even though we had a somewhat inauspicious start to the show. Definitely not my usual start to the show, so I'm a little bit annoyed. But I'm sure next week will be better. I will certainly make sure after tonight that I go and kind of like do a rigorous kind of investigation and figure out why everything was so crackly and distorted to start with, because it shouldn't be like that. So I appreciate all of your support, folks. Let's see. Johnny is talking to Bobby and says, "You support us plenty, no need to feel left out." Certainly not. Certainly not, my friend. There is absolutely no obligation for anybody to donate anything. Really. I never ask. I never ask you guys to donate anything. So there's no reason for anybody to feel compelled to, because I don't compel you to. You know, so Bobby, please don't feel compelled to donate anything. The fact is, you are here every week, every Sunday in my show, week after week after week after week. My show cannot really start until you're here, to be honest. No, you know, a show is just not right if Bobby's not here. So you support me just fine. And I appreciate the fact that you take time out of your Sunday night to do that every week. And, you know, all of you do that. All of you turn up. And, you know, the fact that you're here and the fact that you're asking great questions is worth more to me than anything else. I mean, I appreciate the donations for sure. I really do appreciate the donations, but you know they are not they're not a requisite. So Just Bob says, when mixing strings, especially in the mid and high EQ spectrum, do you try to cap off at certain hertz or frequencies to keep the instruments from getting muddy? Well, muddiness tends to happen at the low end as opposed to the high end. The high end is where things can get a little bit shrill. So if you've got like lots of violins and maybe lots of flutes and they're kind of all hanging out in the upper register, things can get a little bit shrill. So yeah, you do need to kind of keep an eye on when you're EQing, what is the cumulative effect? And this goes for any aspect anywhere on the frequency spectrum. Is if I make this move here on this instrument, and if I make this move over here on this instrument, and if I make this move on this instrument over here, what is going to be the cumulative effect of those 4 moves? So let's say I've made a boost over here, and a boost over here, and a boost over here, and a boost over here. What's going to be the cumulative effect of those boosts when you get to the, you know, to the master fader? What's it going to do to the overall mix? So that's something to be aware of, especially if you're doing EQ in multiple stages, like I am in this mix. I'm going to show you this, actually, just because I think it would make things a little bit easier. So let's go over to Studio One. And you're looking at my mix to Chanel from my 2016 EP. And so the important thing here is, I mean, this is where top-down mixing really is actually a good thing. You know, top-down mixing isn't perfect. It has its weaknesses. It has its flaws. It's not a perfect mixing methodology by any means. But what it does mean is that you're doing overall a lot less processing. I mean, particularly on this song, I've got 1 EQ and 1 compressor on each of my buses, and then I'm only doing a little bit of high-pass filtering on my horn section, and I've done some surgical EQ on my piano and Fender Rhodes to get those guys separated out. But that's about it on the individual channels. There's nothing else. There's nothing on the backing vocals or the lead vocals. Hardly a thing on the soprano sax, just a little bit of extra compression. But the thing to be aware of is what you do on your individual channels is then going to go into your bus. So what I do with these horn section channels here is going to go into my horn section bus. So I'm doing 2 stages of EQ. Now, I believe very much in multiple stages of processing, doing a little in every stage. And the reason why I believe in that is because doing a little bit here and then a little bit on the bus, a little bit on the channel, a little bit on the bus, a little bit on the channel, a little bit on the bus, and, you know, so on down the line, means that you're not overloading at any one stage. And this is particularly true of compression. So, I mean, I'm not really doing any compression directly in this song on any of the channels. But if I was, for example, to have a compressor on the Fender Rhodes here and a compressor on the piano, let's say I'm doing 3 dB here, well then when I get to my keys bus over here, you can see I have a compressor set up here as well. And this probably is going to do maybe 2 or 3 dB. So that is going to be 6 dB of compression, but it's not going to feel like 6 dB of compression because I have 2 compressors doing the load. They are sharing the load of compression. So it's not going to feel like 6 dB of compression because it's not going to be slamming like it would if I had a single compressor and the needle is going over to 6 dB. You would certainly feel the compressor working a lot harder. But if I've got 2 compressors doing a little bit, or maybe even 3 compressors doing a little bit, then, you know, you end up with something that is nice and controlled and tamed and shaped, and yet doesn't sound like it's massively processed. It actually sounds pretty transparent. So I hope that answers that question. So I very much believe in doing a little at different stages. Because it means that you end up with a much more transparent result. And certainly that's true with Chanel. You know, it sounds like nothing is really that processed. It sounds like there's not really a whole lot going on. You can't hear any of the compression. You can't really hear anything sticking out EQ-wise, particularly. I mean, I know that there's probably a little bump overall in this whole song at about 400. A little bit. I've not maybe managed the low mids quite as well as I would like in this song. And you know, that's something I took forward into subsequent mixes. Yeah, be careful of that kind of build up there. Particularly when you've got piano and Fender Rhodes, because those guys are sharing pretty much, they are dominating that low mid area. And so if you've got Fender Rhodes and piano and bass all kind of hogging the same kind of area, yes, it can get pretty muddy. So you do have to thin things out a fair amount at that area. Now, does that mean when I isolate the piano, does the piano then sound really spiky and thin? It might well do, but nobody's going to listen to the piano in solo. They're going to listen to the piano in the context of the whole mix. And our ears are very good at being deceived, because you can give the impression that the piano is nice and round and fulsome when it is actually thinned out quite a lot, because I've got the Fender Rhodes there. And I've maybe got some guitars there as well that are kind of filling in some of those frequencies that are now missing from the piano, but you still hear the piano. The piano still sounds like a piano, but it doesn't ever sound like a really, really thinned out piano. But we've made room for the Fender Rhodes. We've made room for the upper harmonic response of the fretless bass. So, yes, I hope that's answered that. Johnny's saying, see, for me, I mix while I write. I feel that mono can limit me from doing too much overdubbing. That's why in some ways I find mono limits the ability to regulate a certain texture. Well, you see, that's why I wouldn't use mono in the writing phase. Now, I tend to, kind of a little bit like you, Johnny, when I'm working on a song, I kind of push up faders to get a balance, because I want to hear, I want the song to, I want to be able to hear the song well. Do you know what I mean? I want to feel like it sounds a little bit, you know, a little bit kind of polished, a little bit on the way. I think everybody does that to some degree. You know, you go, okay, now I can hear the bass great. Now I can hear the drums. Now I can hear the guitars. And I've got this nice little balance going on. So I tend to do, like you, maybe a little bit of a rough mix as I'm writing. Yes, I would do all of that in stereo. I absolutely would. But when it comes to actually, you know, the mix phase, where I'm focused not on writing the song, and I'm focused not on adding any new elements to the song, or arranging the song in that way, and I'm specifically focusing on polishing the song and really bringing it to life, then I do that part in mono. But writing and still adding stuff, no. I stay in stereo for that. I only do mono for mixing. I don't do it for anything else, and I certainly don't send out a mono mix to a client and say, here's your mix. No, the end result is stereo. The end result is always stereo. The final mix is always stereo. Mono is just a methodology for getting separation between the elements of the mix. That's it. That's all I use it for. And I think really that's all, when we talk about mixing in mono, that's all we're talking about. All we're talking about is using the mono button to deliberately collapse everything in on itself so that you can use EQ in a much more surgical and precise manner to separate those instruments. And then when you can hear them all clearly and distinctly and separately in mono, you can hit the stereo button and everything flips out to stereo. But only now you've got a lot more depth, you've got a lot more breadth, you've got a lot more width in your mix. And you're not fooling yourself by panning things across out of the way of each other. And thinking that you've got separation by panning. You know, separation does do some, panning, does do some separating, but you have to think about the end user as well. How's the end user going to be listening to this? Are they going to be listening to it on their speaker on their phone? Are they going to be listening to the music playing in the corner of the lounge whilst they're in the kitchen? Are they going to be listening on the toilet whilst the music is playing in the lounge? And by the time, and I've said it several times in this show now, but by the time the music gets to their ears, it's not in stereo at that point. It just isn't. So you want them, wherever they are in the house, to be able to hear all the elements of the mix as much as is physically possible. And so that really is all that mono is for. It is just a tool for mixing. It's not kind of anything else. So I hope that I've got that across. Because that certainly is my intention. And we've got big thumbs up from Jonny. That's good. Mike from Peace Valley Audio says, I generally try not to boost the highs on violins and violas. I may boost the viola and cut the violin. I spend a great deal of time searching frequencies to get the overtones. Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And that is the great way to do it. And Jonny agrees with that. Ken says, still doing a lot of experimenting. Orchestra is way more challenging than I thought it would be. Yes, orchestra is extremely challenging mixing. And extremely challenging arranging-wise and writing-wise. You can have the best sample library in the world for an orchestra and still make it sound rubbish. Because you don't understand orchestration. I'm not saying you specifically can. I'm just saying, a lack of actual understanding of orchestration and what elements of the orchestra work well together can still, even if you've got like $1,000 worth of glorious, pristine samples of an orchestra with every possible conceivable articulation. You can have all of that. You can spend $5,000 on the best orchestral library in the world, and your end result still doesn't work and still doesn't sound very good. Because it's about learning how to effectively orchestrate and arrange for the orchestra so that you don't have trumpets playing the same thing as flutes, for example. Or you don't have bassoons playing the same thing as, tenor horns or whatever. Where something is going to overwhelm something else, you try and avoid that. So, for example, writing for a flute and a tenor saxophone. The tenor saxophone is going to be way louder and way bigger in sound than a flute. Even when the flute is played by the best flute player in the world, it's still going to get overwhelmed in the natural. Yes, you can enhance the flute by a microphone, but never write an arrangement with the assumption that anything is going to be mic'd up, because it might not be. So don't write that way. I learned that the hard way. I wrote this wonderful piece, and I thought it was absolutely beautiful. And I had some beautiful harmonies worked out with this between this alto sax and this flute. But when we actually came to perform it, you couldn't hear the flute at all. And so the melody sounded weird because all you could hear was the alto sax part, which was the harmony part. And it just didn't work because the alto sax totally overwhelmed the flute. What I should have done is I should have had a call and response style technique going between the flute and the alto sax. So maybe the flute takes up the first part of the melody, and then the alto sax answers with the second half of the melody. And, you know, they keep doing this, and maybe we switch it around. Maybe now the alto takes the lead, and now the flute takes the response. Alto takes the lead, flute takes the response. And, you know, juggle it about. And that way you avoid those kind of overwhelming things. So that's really an arranging thing and an orchestration thing. So I hope that helps. Deer Creek says the surround mixing and cakewalk. Wait, that just jumped and I missed that. Deer Creek says the surround mixing and cakewalk sonar is limited to surround buses only, of which you can make one of the buses a master bus. I didn't know that. There we go. Johnny Guy was saying to Mike, I disagree with the price point. I have heard superior samples out of some cheap VSTs sometimes. Yep. Mike says, I find the Studio One orchestra very limiting sometimes. Too much time spent EQing. Well, you know what, Mike, for the price point that they're at, and I'm speaking very directly here to the price point that they are at, you'd be hard-pressed to find anything as good at that price point. Now, obviously, if you compare that to the Vienna Philharmonic library or the East-West library or something else in that $800 to $1,500 price bracket, then yes, it's the Presonus Symphonic Orchestra is going to sound a little bit weak in comparison. But at that price point that it is at and that it is aimed for, it is extremely good. Extremely good. You know, I use it for orchestral mock-ups, and then I send the tracks to Notion, and Notion prints out the charts, and I send the charts off to the orchestra for, you know, to record. And that's how I use it. So actually, I'm only using it to create mock-ups that, you know, that will get replaced ultimately. Does that mean that I think the PSO is bad and that I would never use it to actually write something? No. I think the PSO is good. It's very, very good. But it doesn't really compare to something that's you know, $5,000. But other than that, I think it's outstanding. Sheila says, I love strings, but wouldn't know how to record them. There's a variety of ways in which you can record strings. If you're talking about a strings section, then you would probably record them with a spaced stereo pair of mics. You could individually spot mic each one of your violins, but, you know, obviously each individual spot mic is going to take up a channel on your mixer. So if you have the processing power by which you could easily process more than 200 channels of audio, then go ahead, spot mic everything. But if you don't have that, capacity, then you need to think about spaced pair stereo miking or XY configuration miking. Again, a stereo array over each of the sections of the orchestra. Obviously, that means you're kind of limited a little bit mixing-wise. It means you can only mix sections. You can't really mix, you know, individual violins or individual violas or individual cellos or anything like that. But you could certainly get shape an overall tone of the first violins, shape an overall tone of the second violins, violas, cellos, first and second cellos, and then, you know, the same for double basses. You could shape an overall tone for each one of those sections with, you know, XY configuration microphones or space pair microphones, just making sure that the microphones are in phase. That's all you need to do, really. Condenser mics are a good option. Ribbon mics are also another good option. Deer Creek says, back before stereo TVs, almost all TV stations used a single Auratone speaker mono mix for their audio reference. People then started buying a second Auratone. They actually used to be rack mounted. That's interesting to know. Didn't know that. Steve Louth's here. Good to see you, buddy. He's just got back from playing a gig. Appreciate you dropping by, my friend. Okay, let's see what else we've got down the bottom. Bobby is correct. I have some videos on the PSO. Yes, Mike, I know you didn't say it was bad. And I do know you have better samples than those. And that's absolutely fine. Use the better ones. But I think, you know, you're kind of not necessarily comparing apples to apples by doing so. You know, the East-West library is obviously going to be better than the PSO library. Why? Because it's more expensive. So, yeah. So there you go. Let's see. Let's see, have I missed anything? Dickwick says, I've heard a good technique to have 3 or 4 real strings and then put the MIDI stuff behind it. Yes, that does work. I think many successful writers have done that. Yes, I have done that too. Deer Creek says the PS videos are great, made me pop for them, and I use them quite a bit in my stuff. Cool. Yes, and you love the cellos and double basses. I think they are pretty much the. I think those are the stars of the string section of the Persona Symphonic Orchestra. The cellos and the double basses. The cellos sound gorgeous, especially in the kind of upper mid and high register. They sound really, really nice. They don't sound thin, and they don't sound scratchy and artifacty like some libraries do. I'm not naming names of libraries, but in some cases, cellos have been very badly sampled in some surprisingly expensive libraries. But I think the PSO, when they sampled these cellos, I mean, they basically hired the London Symphony Orchestra to do the sessions for all of the samples, which will not have been cheap. I know, because I used to work in an orchestra called the English Sessions Orchestra when I lived down in London and worked down there as a session musician. One of the things I worked in was the English Sessions Orchestra, and that meant we got to play on TV themes, radio themes. We got to play on film scores. We did a lot of different things. We played on some fairly well-known records, and so it wouldn't have been cheap to hire the London Symphony Orchestra to by Personas to make that PSO library. So they did put some effort into it. Let's see. Lollipop Gill is here. Just Bob, I think he's on his way to dinner. Thank you for coming, Just Bob. I appreciate it. Let's see. He says good night. Bob Powell says, I use my granddaughter who's a fantastic cello player. Well, that's always a good thing. Keep it in the family, my friend. Absolutely. Deer Creek says, what I like about the PSO and dislike also is they won't let you really get out of the range of the instrument. But if you do go too low, it changes the articulation. Well, that's because the articulations are mapped to keys outside of the register of the instrument. They've actually been very careful about mapping to the actual playing, the real life playing register of each of the instruments, which is actually a very good thing, that you can't actually go outside of the register of a real cello Why? Because you can't play lower than a certain note on a cello. In real life, you can't get a cello player to do it. So, that was a production decision that they made, that they were going to keep it real, and I appreciate the fact that they keep it real. And so, by way of doing that, they mapped all of the key switches for the different articulations in the section of your MIDI keyboard below the written and physically capable range of the instrument. And that's very deliberate. So I actually don't think that that is a bad thing. I think that is an extremely good thing, and I think that that's extremely well thought out. Because unless you are deliberately wanting a cello sound to sound artificial, and to sound like a MIDI cello, to sound like a fake synthesized cello, you want to keep it in the playing register of the actual instrument, and be realistic. And that way, most people in the general public are not going to know the difference between you playing a cello line on the PSO cello versus an actual cello player playing a real cello. Most people will not be able to, by ear, tell the difference, providing you keep it real. But if you decide to play notes that are either too high or too low for the cello, it'll sound weird. And people will be able to, most people will be able to say, that doesn't sound realistic. And they'll quickly be able to identify that as a synthesized sound. So I think that was actually an excellent decision that they made. Ken says, with the PSO, all your key articulations in the right of the instrument, it looks like I need different tracks to have different articulations, like changing from pizzicato to legato, PSO key switch. Not necessarily. You can change them on the fly, just by using your left hand on the articulation area. Change them on the fly, press the particular key that goes to pizzicato when you're playing legato, and just keep playing. Or you can draw those articulation changes in the MIDI editor. So you don't need to have like different channels. You really don't have to do that. I mean, that is one way in which you can do it, but I would say no. Deer Creek says, sometimes I'd like the bass guitar to go lower, like a 5-string bass. But you can on some patches. Yes, you can, because you can get 5- and 6-string basses. And they will go down to a low B. But don't write a B flat or an A for a bass guitar. It will sound artificial. Because unless you deliberately detune the B string on a 5-string or a 6-string bass, as those instruments cannot get that low. So, but again, it depends upon your rationale. If you've got a clear rationale for, being able to do that, and it doesn't bother you whether it sounds artificial or not, for the particular production objectives you have, then that's fine. That's fine. If the song requires you to make it sound artificial, and it doesn't bother you that it sounds artificial, then go for it. Pitch bend away, whatever you need to do. But I think otherwise, just try and keep it real, would be my advice. Steve Lau says, good night, guys. Need to get a shower and get some Zeds. I'll see you on the flippity flop. Awesome. Thanks for coming. I'm going to wrap this show up in just a minute. Deer Creek says, I wish the articulations could be disabled or moved. Well, then it would be a lot harder to switch between the different articulations if they were moved. Just transpose your keyboard if they're getting in the way. Shift your actual MIDI keyboard pitch down, and then the articulation section will shift down out of the range of the keyboard anyway, and then you can still play. That'd be one way to do it. But yeah, I think they're just fine where they are, to be honest. So with that in mind, I think we're going to wrap the show up there. I'm really sorry, folks, for the bad start to the show. It hasn't really the show tonight hasn't really worked out how I intended, and I apologize for that. Because Jonny and I were going to discuss this subject of mixing in mono, and my plan was that we would demonstrate that as well in Studio One and show you just how easy it is to be able to separate a bunch of guitars in mono, and rather how effective the end result is. I was all set up to do that, but for whatever reason, we had technical gremlins tonight, so I apologize. I'm going to call it there. And I'm going to say a very good night to everybody. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And I promise you next week's show will be much, much better. I will see you guys all on Wednesday. I think Jonny and I are still having Songwriting Simplified this week on Wednesday. I think it's still this week on Wednesday. I think that's correct. Jonny will confirm that in the chat. I'm pretty sure. I appreciate all of your donations and your kindness and your kind words towards me tonight. And when I was getting a little flustered, I appreciate that very much. So I will see you guys all on Wednesday over on the HST live streams channel, where Jonny and I will discuss all things songwriting and arranging and that kind of thing. And I'm sure there'll be some mirth and hilarity along the way as well, because there usually is in our shows, let's face it. So, good night, everybody, and thanks very much for coming. And I will see you all Wednesday. Good night. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. Of course, Jonny.